And Liz Cheney said that at the outset. I mean, they can make criminal referrals. Do you agree with Brian? Have they fallen short in terms of Donald Trump's legal culpability?
Well, I agree with Brian, Christian, as far as that they did not achieve the standard that Brian enunciated, which is they did not definitively tie Donald Trump to Oath Keepers or groups or him telling people to go to Congress directly and be armed and cause violence. But Congress did lay out, I think, a very understandable a narrative that I think they can support very, very strongly. And they said, look, first off, it's okay to be mistaken about crazy theories. It's even okay to be a sore loser. But what Donald Trump did was he knew darn well that these theories about stolen votes and stuffed ballots and all that were nonsense. He privately acknowledged that, but then publicly to millions of people over weeks following the election kept telling them things that he knew to be false. And then on the day of January 6th, with the knowledge that the Secret Service had, knowing people were armed and incited and excitable, Donald Trump then kind of lit that spark. And sure enough, not surprisingly, that armed and energetic and angry mob marched on Congress. So I think that's a very understandable narrative. Are the elements there of a criminal prosecution? Maybe. It's not as bad as what Brian, they could have done, but I do think they did a nice job in synthesizing something that people can understand.
We'll come to the subpoena later in the programme and where the legal jeopardy is with that. I'm just wondering what a criminal referral would look like. Liz Cheney said that ultimately is where they're heading. They've got to produce their interim report, then their final report, and then that referral to the DOJ. On what grounds would they refer in?
It would be an argument that there should be a conspiracy to commit election fraud or conspiracy to defraud the government. It'll be a wide-ranging argument that Donald Trump took steps to effectuate preventing the government, preventing Congress, and specifically Vice President Mike Pence from doing his constitutional duty, which is to certify valid electors. And so that's and they don't have to prove that it went back weeks and months or that it was before the election, frankly. They can say he took these steps. It was not ultimately successful, but it doesn't have to be, right? It can be an attempt. So it would be unprecedented. It's not a case that's routinely brought because this is such a strange and unique situation. So trying to guess whether it would be successful or not is difficult. But you can see the contours and you can see the elements of a crime that could definitely be laid out here.
Let's get into that, because since the last public hearing, the committee has gained access to tens of thousands of emails and electronic messages that were sent by the Secret Service in the weeks leading up to the riot. One of those emails revealed how Trump challenging the election in December 2020. Just FYI, POTUS is pissed. Breaking news, Supreme Court denied his lawsuit. He is livid now. The White House aide Cassidy Hutchinson told the committee how he reacted to that news.
So he had said something to the effect of, I don't want people to know we lost, Mark. This is embarrassing. Figure it out. We need to figure it out. I don't want people to know that we lost.
Perhaps the most relevant material to the question we were asking from the Secret Service files were the messages that were being exchanged by agents as the crowd gathered on the ellipse ahead of Donald Trump's speech. Here's Adam Schiff.
Some members of the crowd are wearing ballistic helmets, body armor, carrying radio equipment and military-grade backpacks. Another, from 9:30 a.m., said that there were possibly OC spray, meaning pepper spray, and/or plastic riot shields. At 11:23 a.m., agents also reported possible armed individuals, one with a Glock, one with a rifle. Over the next hour, agents reported possible man with a gun reported, confirmed pistol on hip located in a tree, and one detained at 14th and I Street Northwest. Individual had an assault rifle on his person.
Congressman Schiff said the Secret Service were aware the evening before who was in Washington and what their intentions were. The former Deputy White House Press Secretary, Judd Deere, told the committee that Trump talked at length about how fired up the crowd outside the White House was. That morning, the Secret Service told the president that some of his supporters trying to get through the screening machines, the mags, were armed. Here's Cassidy Hutchinson again.
I overheard the president say something to the effect of, I don't effing care that they have weapons. They're not here to hurt me. Take the effing mags away. Let them in. Let my people in. They can march to the Capitol after the rally's over. They can march from the ellipse. Take the effing mags away.
And yet, in his speech, he told them to march on the Capitol. In fact, he wanted to join them, to physically walk to the Capitol against the advice of his staff and to the great consternation of his Secret Service agents. Here's committee member Pete Aguilar.
He knew well before 2 p.m. that a violent riot was underway at the Capitol. He was aware of the ongoing lawlessness, but his motorcade was held on West Executive Avenue outside the White House because he still wanted to join the crowd.
So my question, Joe, relating to what he knew and whether he was legally culpable, is that he'd been alerted and warned several times by his most senior aides and by his Secret Service agents that the people were armed, and yet he wanted to go with them. He knew what their intention was, and he was desperate to go along with it.
Christian, that's the most damning evidence that this committee has elicited over all these months. I mean, you don't need all this stuff about what happened in the weeks prior and whether this was a long-cooked strategy to lie about the election. That's all interesting. It's fascinating, but it's not necessary. Right? The key details are if President Trump knew there was an armed and angry crowd, that he was getting riled up by telling them falsehoods about an election, and then he encouraged them to walk to the Capitol, and he encouraged them to interfere with what Vice President Mike Pence was supposed to do that day, which was to count the valid electoral votes. That's it. I mean, that's the whole story. Everything else is window dressing. Everything else is additional detail. It's extremely damaging. And so if you, like you said, pull that thread with respect to how much did the Secret Service know that day and the day before, and in the weeks prior to that there were armed crowds going to come to Washington for January 6th, and whether the Secret Service communicated that to the White House, that's critical. That's very, very important information. The most important thing that came out of today's hearing.
Many of his supporters, Joe, do still think the election was stolen. Is it a defence for the former president that he thinks it was stolen or that he was duped? Not that the evidence points in that direction, because there's plenty of evidence that they've shown today that he did know he'd lost. But is it a defence to say, look, I honestly think the election was fraudulent?
I think it could have been a good defense, Christian, had we not seen a lot of the evidence that we've seen. I think that it could have started out that way. Donald Trump could have said, on the advice of my legal advisors, I believe there were legitimate issues with voting in certain states and certain cities, and I'm looking into it. And he can kind of, stick with that for a while. The problem is when courts just one after the other reject your claims, and not because the claims weren't strong, it's because there were no claims at all. There really was nothing to support them. It turned out to be just sort of baseless. They're telling you, Mr. President, people like the Attorney General, Bill Barr, who said, this is nuts, this is nonsense. There's nothing there. At some point, you can't keep holding on to that and then use that as a good faith defense. So, yes, while you could have maybe at some point said that, Donald Trump could have argued that, I don't see how that would hold up now under any kind of scrutiny.
We're going to take a short break. Do stay with us. We're going to look at plenty more of what we got from the committee today. We'll look at the evidence in its entirety. We'll look at the role the committee has played, and we'll also look at the legal ramifications for the former president. Don't go away. Ultimate backstop, of course, Joe, is the Supreme Court, and they have played a role in previous elections deciding who was the legitimate president. Think back to the election of George W. Bush. This time, the committee said that they have heard evidence from Ginny Thomas, who is, of course, the wife of a Supreme Court justice. Does that undermine Justice Thomas's position on the court, that his wife is an election denier and was supportive of what Donald Trump was doing?
Well, Christian, I mean, that would have been very interesting had we learned more about that testimony. It wasn't discussed at all today. I question whether the Supreme Court would have any role in the election, any election coming up. I think it's the last thing they want to do. I go back to the point, and I've said this before. I mean, this hearing that's now basically concluded, this was the impeachment investigation that should have taken place. I mean, Congress did have a way to investigate, convict, and bar Donald Trump from running again. And that was the impeachment investigation. And they instead, rather than take the time and do it right, they rushed it. They wanted to get it done within a week while he was still in office. And I think, and so he was impeached. He was not convicted for a second time, and therefore he was not barred from office. So now, a year and a half later, I think had this been the impeachment investigation, I think they would have gotten many more Republicans, whether through shame or whether through conscience, would have voted to convict. They would have reached that 2/3 conviction necessary in the Senate, and I think that could have resolved at least the problem of Donald Trump.
Yeah,
so
we know that he did.
This sort of,
I mean, we know that Mitch McConnell did prevaricate right up to the day of the vote. He didn't know which way he was going to vote. And one does wonder if he'd been presented with the evidence that we've seen over the last 9 public hearings, whether in fact he might have changed his vote.
Well, I think not just Mitch McConnell, but I think any Republican who would consider, after seeing all this evidence, still not voting to convict, then they'd have to face the voters. And I think then you'd have the democratic way work its process, which is that the voters hold their elected officials accountable for the things they do or don't do. Yeah. So I think Congress really dropped the ball here. And so this is maybe the next best thing. And now we have this possible referral to the Justice Department. But, I mean, this could have been handled very differently.
Yeah. Amanda makes the point, Joe, that Republicans have short memories, but they face the perpetual pressure of the media machine that is behind Donald Trump, and that is different to what Nixon had. I mean, he has conspiracy channels, he has MAGA channels, he has his own Twitter feed. And point in case, he has just tweeted, so we've had some reaction from Truth Social in the last few minutes. This is what he says. He says, why didn't the unselected committee ask me to testify months ago? Why did they wait until the very end, the final moments of their last meeting? Because the committee is a total bust that has only served to further divide our country, which, by the way, is doing very badly, a laughingstock all over the world. I mean, we know, we're going to talk about it in a second, that he's not going to testify. But this is the point for Republicans, is that he's there and he's ever present, and the pressure comes from the supporters via the channels.
Well, Christian, you're right. I mean, I don't envy nationally elected or federally elected Republicans these days, because at some point they're going to have to choose a team, right? And I think it's going to be fascinating. Once these midterms are behind us next month, it's going to be all focused on the presidential nomination and who's going to be the nominee for the Republicans. I do think the Democrats made a major misstep, though, in the committee by not allowing Republicans to name their own members. And by hand-picking the 2 Republicans, which are Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger, the Democrats effectively gave the excuse, well, this committee is all partisan because there's no real Republicans on it. I think that was a misstep. And I think if you had let Jim Jordan or other members of the House join the committee, sure, they may have made a commotion and they may not have participated like the Democrats wanted them to, but then there wouldn't be that argument that this was a partisan committee. And so I think that was another misstep here. If the Republicans had some real kind of skin in the game on this committee, I think it may have forced them to step up and take it more seriously rather than sort of shrugging it off.
Hold that thought, because I want to talk about the way congressional committees have changed in the wake of what has happened. But I want to get to the subpoena because it's an important part of the day. At the end of the hearing today, the panel did vote to subpoena the president. Of course, the vote was approved unanimously. We know that. And we'll talk in a second about what that might mean. But here is the moment.
Committee Resolution 1 resolved that the chairman be and is hereby directed to subpoena Donald J. Trump for documents and testimony in connection with the January 6th attack on the United States Capitol.
If there's no further debate, the question is on agreeing to the resolution. Those in favor will say aye.
Aye. Aye.
Those opposed is no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it.
Criminal contempt, one of the 3 options the congressional panel could pursue. Against Trump ally Steve Bannon after he refused to comply with their subpoena deadline. Would they go that far with the former president, Joe?
The calendar is the committee's worst enemy, Christian, because they're going to have to do all of this in the next few weeks, right? They're going to have to issue the subpoena. They're going to have to give Donald Trump a chance to comply or refuse. Then they'll have to have a vote on contempt, and then they'll have to send it over to the Justice Department and see, in fact, if they do anything with it. All before the next Congress is seated, where most likely Republicans will control the House. So, I think it might be a little too little too late. It was dramatic. I was not expecting it, and I think it was a good move. But the likelihood of it actually happening is extremely remote.
Yeah, one does imagine, Joe, that sets a precedent that Republicans will follow if they get the majority. They don't necessarily have to have a plethora of Democrats on the panel.
Yeah, I hope not. I think it is a bad precedent. It would be it's very contrary to the nature of these kinds of committees in Congress, and I really hope Republicans do not emulate it and make this sort of a habit going forward. It really undermined the whole process. Also, the committee took too long, frankly. I mean, they had a lot of work to do. It was important work, but they waited so long. People have a short attention span, and a year and a half after an event happens, with all that's also happened in the interim, and a midterm coming up in 28 days, think they did a good job or not. People have a lot else going on right now, and so I think they could have done. If they had done this a lot faster, and had they made it bipartisan, it could have had a much more high likelihood of success than it does right now.
Well, let's get into that. Joe, Brian made a really good point, though. Whether or not this damages his ability to run in 2024, you can understand why Republicans are turning on what the committee is putting out there now. But in 2024, there's going to be a stable of Republican candidates who are going to pick up some of this stuff, because this is the stuff that they will defeat him with.
Right. I mean, I almost wonder, Christian, if Democrats almost want to run against Donald Trump, who I personally don't think can win a national election again. So I almost wonder if the choice whether to indict him, which of course should be made completely without political considerations, but I have to wonder if people are in the back of their minds are saying, you know what, if we indict him, that might be justice. We might pursue justice. But if we don't indict him, we have him to run against, and we can, kind of regurgitate all these things that the committee, has uncovered, and we can revisit January 6th again, and we can talk about the chaos that he's strewn, after his term and during his term. So it'll be really interesting to see how the legal interplays with the political here. And my guess is, the story's not over with this last final hearing of the committee.
That is where we must leave it. Joe Moreno, Amanda Renteria, Brian Lanza, lovely to have your company this evening to go through it all. Just one line of news to give you before we go. The committee's just said that the subpoena for Donald Trump will come in a matter of days. We will see how he responds to that and in what form. Thank you very much for watching. We'll see you same time on Monday. Good night.